Okay, cool. So this was a series of equations created by a physicist and mathematician known by the name as James Clerk Maxwell. Now, prior to my having discovered these equations, Maxwell, for most Americans, was one of the finer coffees before Starbucks came along. And if you happen to be at Syracuse University, you might know the Maxwell House of Politics. That was about it. Or if you're a Beatles fan, you might remember his silver hammer. But otherwise, as a physicist and mathematician, not many people are aware of what his equations are all about. His equations, I'll just tell you this, I made a lot of notes for the class to work through here. His equations were written in the year 1861 to 1862, and they are the foundation of classical electromagnetism, classical optics, and electric circuits. Now, why is that interesting, and how are we going to tie this into Hanukkah? First of all, Albert Einstein's special and general relativity theories are built upon Maxwell's formulas. So there are very important formulas way beyond things that we may know. However, what's more important, I'm going to just read this straight out of his text. These equations marked the unification, that's the key word, of a theory which was previously understood as separately described phenomena, meaning magnetism, electricity, light, and associated radiation. They had all been understood as separate elements. He created something which then created a term which is used often called space-time. As opposed to space and time, it becomes one element which is known as space-time. Space-time, you can check this on Google if you want. Space-time, that's what they say, the only person who gets away with a lie these days, or I guess you have to be Shomer Shabbat, is if they lie on Shabbat, because it's the only time you can't quickly check on Google if it's true or not. But you can certainly check on Google now if you want, space-time, and you'll see that space-time is understood as a mathematical model which fuses the 3 dimensions of space and the 1 dimension of time into a single 4-dimensional unit. So, right, we have space and time, 3 parts space, 1 part time, that together create a single unit, okay? Now, why is this fascinating? I mean, assuming even if you're not into science or math, why is this fascinating? First of all, actually, maybe I should just preference this. Many of you familiar with the project I worked on for 30 years called the People's Talmud. And I'm not sure if I have another 30 years, but I have begun another project now called the People's Zohar. So this is actually the first time that I'm ever building a class from using the People's Zohar, although there are a lot of Talmudic sources in here. And so I'll just share with you that anyone who's interested in the source material here, I'm happy to provide it to Rabbi Tamar at a later time for you. But each time I'll be quoting the Zohar, it's not all one long piece of the Zohar. The pieces I chose here are from the introduction to the Zohar, as well as Zohar on Sefer Bereshit, on the first book of the Torah. But what we want to look at here is a phenomenal piece of Zohar that predicts that in the year 1840, this will be a time that God will begin, as the language of the Zohar says, to open up the gates of heaven and reveal a deep understanding of science and the creation of the world. So I want to suggest that many of the points which are highlighted by Maxwell in his equation are fundamental Zohar concepts of creation itself, except the Zohar takes it a few steps further than Maxwell did. So we'll have a look at that.
You have to explain to some people what Zohar is in 2 words.
I have to?
Yeah, you have to. Because Jessica doesn't know. Jessica doesn't know and Renee doesn't know.
Okay, fine. You know, there's an expression here in Hebrew, in Israel, they say, somebody says to somebody, how are you? And then he says, in a word, good. And the guy says, well, how about in 2 words? Not good. So, you know, the Zohar is for the outside world, a controversial text. For the inside Torah world, a revelation of the esoteric aspects of Torah, attributed to its authorship with Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, who is buried in Maron, the student of Rabbi Akiva. So that's the Zohar is actually, Zohar comes from the word light, which is actually the backbone of our whole upcoming class. And so that's what the Zohar does. It exposes deeper levels than is normally found in Talmudic literature or in the biblical language or the verses found in the Tanakh and in the Bible. So the Zohar begins by telling us that in the year 1840, these gates will open, which is very interesting, of course, because Maxwell's equations were written in 20 years later, which probably means he didn't begin at 5 minutes before 20 years, but it was a process that had begun an awakening. But what's more interesting is that in Jewish thought, we also describe creation in terms of 4 elements. Now, we look at those 4 elements as what secular people may refer to as the older knowledge of creation. That's okay, but they basically are categories as opposed to specifics. But the categories are, as everybody knows, air, water, fire, and earth. In Kabbalah, air, water, and fire are always associated with space because they exist, but they're not a tool of measurement in space. They only occupy a place in space. And therefore, the element which represents time is Earth, because the rotation of the planet, the actual nature of Earth, is one that generates time. Because time, we're not going to go into a class on time, but time, in a very simple sense, is rooted in the movement of the planets and even in the rotation of Earth. So Earth is always associated with time, whereas these other 3 elements, which interface obviously inside of time, but primarily function from space. So there is an idea of 3 elements of space. In our language, they would be air, water, and fire, and 1 element of time, which would be Earth, which would be combining into a single entity. This entity is referred to as Kiryat Arba. Kiryat Arba is a city which exists to this day just next to the city of Hebron. It's actually considered a suburb of Hebron, but it's also a city which is mentioned in the Torah. In fact, it was in last week's Parsha when talking about the burial place of Sarah. It says that she was buried in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron. That's the simple language. In a city called Kiryat Arba, Kiryat is like a city, a gathering, and Arba is the number 4. And it's in the city called Hebron. The Zohar, however, goes deeper. No, Kiryat Arba is a reference to the 4 elements. And Hebron means in Hebrew, lechaber, to unite, to create a unity from elements. And so therefore, Hebron, chibor, which means to join, is the power to take these 4 elements and unify them as one. So that actually all of creation now is, as Maxwell suggested, if light, let's say, is the underpinning, which we will understand a few more minutes from the Zohar. So it's all about elements in a unified single form and fashion. Now, Gomorrah, just to jump out of the Zohar for a minute, says that on the first day of creation, 10 things were created as opposite pairs. They are heaven and in juxtaposition, earth, toho, uboho, which we will get into, and therefore I'm not going to translate them yet, just leave it as that, light and darkness, air and water, and day and night, which is very interesting because if you look here at the Talmud, you see that light and darkness are not normally or automatically equated with the idea of day and night. Those are separate entities. I can't tell if you're raising your hand like in a class or just shooting a fly away.
I want to raise my hand because
Okay,
I would
sorry.
like you to repeat these 10 elements and 5 pairs.
So
Okay.
one more time, the 10 elements as opposites.
Yes.
Heaven and earth, tohu bohu, which we'll get to in a few minutes, hopefully, light and darkness, air and water, and day and night. One of the great commentators on the Talmud, known as the Maharasha, explains that these 10 elements are really air, water, fire, and earth, which are the basic elements of creation, and heaven. Heaven, which is the spiritual entity. And heaven, as a spiritual entity, or I should say differently, a spiritual component, they create the spectrum of time and space, plus quantity and quality. That's his language. And light is what holds them all together. So once again, Maxwell talks about the unity of 4 elements and is referring in that category of light being the primary component of what these are, even though we refer to them as the 4 elements of creation, because we'll see that all creation comes from light in a few more minutes, and they are, in a sense, unity. As an aside, just because we're going to need to understand these terms, the Talmud gives an explanation of what this word tohu means and translates it as chaos. It says, and I can't begin to explain this because it'll be a whole class in itself, but sometimes, you know, in a class, you're going to have your cognitive brain on, which is computing the data, and then your imaginative brain, which kind of goes into a cross between, I guess, Andy Warhol and Peter Max, that just allows the colors and the visuals and just let it go in the back, and at some point it'll seep forward into your understanding. So, for example, here, the Gemara explains that this concept of chaos is a green line surrounding the planet Earth from which darkness comes. And it says that there is also a line of darkness that surrounds heaven, which is a phenomenal idea. As we will see, hopefully, that if creation is all about blinding, brilliant light, that there should be darkness surrounding heaven. This is hinted at in a small form by telling us that when Musa, went up on Mount Sinai, so at the very top of Mount Sinai, there was a dark cloud that no one could see. Now here you have Mount Sinai, the most unbelievable revelation of all creation, and yet at the pinnacle is darkness. So in brief, this is because, as we'll see, the word for earth in Hebrew, olam, is connected to the Hebrew word alam, which means hidden. So therefore, all which is real light will only be hidden from our perspective to our eyes in this world. So Talmud then goes on, explains the other word, abohu, which means void. So you have chaos and void. So this is described metaphorically, which I really am not going to go into, but metaphorically is described as huge stones which are deep in the center of the earth from where water is created. But that's not for now. It's off our subject. The Zohar, however, uses different visual imagery. That was the imagery of the Talmud. The Zohar, dealing with the definition or trying to help us understand or trying to help us not understand what tohu and bohu is all about, the Zohar says that in a very early primordial state of the creation of earth, when the earth was covered with snow mixed with water, the world was hit by a huge fire, which maybe we can interject meteorite. Hard to know what that means, but it was hit with a huge fire that impacted the snow and changed it into a substance called without form, which is the word tohu. The language of the Zohar is that everything which was created is created with clothing, which we'll come to in a few minutes. It's a very important idea. Everything created is created with clothing, except for this chaos of tohu. The language of the Zohar, also goes on to say, ultimately, this tohar went through, or let's say encountered, the four elements, and as a result of it, was converted into, from without form to void. It's hard to kind of imagine what is void and how is that different than the term without form, but that void is referring to bohu. But bohu has image and form. I'll explain this on one little brief idea. You know, there's always the famous philosophy of I am because I think, right? My thoughts are really 99.9% of my life, and the other 0.1% are also my thoughts. And yet, my thoughts have no physical substance. You can't touch a thought. So the thoughts have no substance, but yet they guide my entire life. So they exist and they don't exist within this world. This is hinted at in a phenomenally difficult passage in the Talmud that contrapositions two sets of verses in the Torah that clearly, when put one next to the other, are conflicting. They are discussing the measurements of the Aron, the ark, which held the Torah that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, and where it's positioned in the temple. And it says that the ark is 10 amot, basically elbow to top finger, whatever, X distance, 10 amot long. And then the distance from the end of the ark to the wall is 10 amot on both sides. Simple math, 30 amot is wall to wall. In a separate area of the text, not discussing the ark at all, says that the width between the two walls is 20 amot. So the Talmud, in classic Talmudic nature, steps and says, what? How can it be 30 amot and how can it be 20 amot? So the Talmud gives the obvious answer, which is that the ark existed and didn't exist. Similar to our thoughts. They exist, they're there, they're very real, but yet they really do not exist. And so that idea of our thoughts as something which is very tangible is the battleground of our reality, because it's within our space of our thinking, or our soul and our spirit, we have our free will, and how from there we decide what to do in our lives. What kind of actions do we take in the things that we do? It's all coming from that idea of the soul. So the soul, as we'll see in a few more minutes, has a kind of like, almost if you remember early software, when the software is coming down and it comes to the question box, it has two options inside, the 0 or the 1. If it hits the 1, it means it got the right answer, if you will, and the flow chart continues to flow. If it hits the 0, it has to go back up and rework itself until it gets to the right answer. We might use the term reincarnate until you get it right, and then you're free to move on to other planets. But that idea is therefore that free will between the 0, which is nothingness, which is without form, which is void, and the oneness of everything, which is creation. This is where our soul battles. Do we live in the human image of God, or do we become like the Nachash, like the snake? So this idea of the struggle between the two is highlighted in the fact that hold off, we'll come back to the idea of the snake for a minute. Still want to miss this point here before. Okay. This light, according to the Zohar, which bonds all the elements of creation, is based upon a simple concept. This fifth element is based upon the idea that the whole is greater than the sum total of the parts. This soul, this spiritual energy, this light, this is the thing which holds all of the elements of creation together. The Zohar talks about this light. It talks about something which is a very interesting idea. It's called before creation. So how can you have something which is before creation? So I want to take a little side detour here, just kind of zip down a cul-de-sac of thought for a minute, come right back. And that is, you know, many times I'll be teaching and we'll be talking about free will, and then I'll throw out the Zohar that talks about 18,000 other inhabited planets with intelligent beings and so on. And everyone, whoa, how could that be? How could our free will, which is the essence of creation, possibly tolerate another entity having free will? Because what if we negated our choices and our free will? Okay, guess what, guys? We are just one little teeny classroom beyond a university of the universe that the human mind is not even built to comprehend. Our little teeny PC we have here is beyond the mainframe. And so within the spectrum of whatever this creation is and whatever our opportunities are and whatever our challenges are, as long as the clock is ticking and we're playing the game, that's what it's all about. So for within our framework as to where we are, when we talk about creation, we have to be open enough to understand we're only talking about this world universe that we are in, its creation. But that's not creation. It's only our creation, if you will. So when the Zohar begins to discuss something like pre-creation, it means before this universe that we are created in. And it uses a term to refer to what it was like pre-creation as called the Or Ein Sof, the light without end. You know, a lot of times if you ask people, what is it like, you know, in the universe, sometimes they'll give you this image of darkness, but actually it's an image of blinding light. The light is so powerful that nothing can be visible, right? It's like the little kid who had to do the art class and freaked out because he forgot, and he comes up to the teacher and gives the teacher a blank piece of white paper, and the teacher says, "What is this?" He says, "What do you mean, what is it?" It's a polar bear in a snowfall in the Arctic, right? So the same idea that sometimes without contrast, there can be nothing visible. We need that contrast to be able to see. So our seeing from a Zohar point of view is blindness. If you want to understand this idea more, you should read Rabbi Nachman's 7 Beggars and focus on the first beggar called the blind beggar. But this idea of blindness means that in fact, everything has to be hidden for only one thing to be revealed. And if you're familiar with how the brain works, this is exactly what the brain does. The brain excludes information in order for us to be able to focus on something in front of us, right? This is why if you ever notice you went from one place to another place that you never went before in your life, and then when you go back, it's faster. How's that work? It's exactly the same distance. The answer is that the first time you're going, it's all new information. So your brain is actively, quickly dealing with the input of data. But when you're going back the second time, it can exclude the data because it doesn't need to process it. It's already worked it through. So the experience of time, let's say time are like little beeps. So therefore, the distance of these beeps, rather than being beep, 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 which would make like a long sensation of time, are just beep, 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 because now it goes faster because there's less friction or less information that the brain is dealing with. So too, this idea of creation began where God had to or chose to hide this light. And then the light became hidden and revealed. It's an important phrase to remember for later in the class. Hidden and revealed. It was simultaneously hidden and at the same time revealed. A new light. And that first pixel that appeared on the screen of what we call creation is what we call Bereshit. That is the dot of creation. It is also the first of the 10 utterances of creation. You have 9 other, and God said. Where's the 10th? The 10th is the word Bereshit. We're not going to go into why there was no audio at that point in creation. But the bottom line is that that first appearance of that light, which is a result of the real light, which was hidden, that is called Bereshit. This light is what the Zohar refers to as creating light for light. God created a new light on behalf of the endless light, of the Or Ein Sof. The second light is revealed as a garment for the first light. Remember, we mentioned before that everything in creation has a garment except for Toho, or except for the soul, if you want. But even light, now for the light to be created or brought into the world, it had to have its own garment. The Sulam, who was a very famous commentator on the Zohar, explains that this new light, the light of the garment, is called the light of kindness, of doing, we call in Hebrew, chesed, of the act of doing kindness. And the light of kindness dresses the light of holy wisdom. Holy wisdom, as opposed to simple intellectual wisdom, is wisdom which is used in the service of spiritual growth, as opposed to intellectual wisdom, which could be used merely as a tool for the growth of one's ego. You know, they always say, I think I might have mentioned this once to the group, but I'm hoping you forgot, that the word ego is an acronym for edging God out, right? That there's no room for God because I'm really too filled with it, the space myself. I think John Wayne said, like, you know, this town ain't big enough for the two of us. But I think that's what God says, like, you know, this body ain't big enough for the two of us. You're going to be there later, amigo. Otherwise, we turn our body into a temple and a place where God dwells. So when a person, therefore, does an act of kindness for another human being, or even an animal, or even our planet, any act of kindness, that kindness is simultaneously within that individual opening up a portal that allows the light of holy wisdom to become a gift from heaven inside of themselves. They, if you will, remove any cholesterol that might be in their spiritual tubes to heaven that stops this flow of light, which automatically brings joy and happiness, and included in it sanity, which fights the chaos because one is in sync with the vibration, or the vibration of creation. Therefore, our humanness, our free will, stands between this light, this wisdom and kindness, versus darkness, which is the tohu and vohu. It's a difference between chaos or lack of form or void versus order and meaning and sense of creation. Okay, that darkness, now back to the Zohar, is called dark fire. That's the term that is used. Zohar says that this great fire was created in the early stages of creation, but instead of it being called fire, it's called darkness. When you read in the Bible, in the opening chapter about creation, God created darkness. That darkness that is being referred to is called dark fire. The Ashlag again explains that what this means is that the power of fire is the power to turn something into nothingness, right? That's what a fire does. It destroys, it removes something from existence. But it's darkness which gives fire that power to create the nothingness, right? Think about that for a minute, because we're going to get to that a little bit later, around 4 in the morning. Kidding. We're going to get that a little bit later about the Hanukkah candles, that there are the candles which you see lit, but there are the lit candles which you don't see, right? Just because we don't see the candle lit doesn't mean the candle isn't lit. So we're going to talk about the lit candles and the unseen lit candles. So if you think about it, the idea of darkness means that you don't see something. So fire in the physical world is the, let's say, tool through which the implementation of nothingness happens. On a simple level, you see the fire, there's a tree. Now there isn't the tree, the fire destroyed it. But on a metaphysical level, what's really happening, while that is true that that is what's happening, in tangent with that, what is happening is darkness now makes that tree no longer visible. Tree exists, but in a different universe, parallel universe, which we'll talk about parallel universes in a few more minutes, but no longer in our universe. It's now been blacked out by this darkness, which is the enabler of fire. The Zohar goes on to say that this darkness is called black fire, because black is the strongest of all colors. And the reason it becomes black is it must be so powerful, because through that black power, it has the ability to fight evil. If it was not black fire, it wouldn't be strong enough to fight evil. This is hinted at in the Torah. It says that Isaac, Yitzchak, towards the end of his life, his eyes became blackened. They became dark. And at that time, towards the end of his life, he calls out to his son Esav, who had reached a mature level of serious evil. But because of Yitzchak's blackened eyes, he was able to look with kindness even at evil. Think about that. It's very easy, hopefully, for us to be kind with people who we like, or we feel sympathy for, or we feel superior, because we're walking down the street and there's some poor person lying on the street and you give them a coin and you really feel big because, hey, and so on. That's easy. But what about being kind to somebody you really detest? What about being kind to somebody you absolutely do not like this person? In fact, in your mind, this person is the incarnation of evil. Could you be kind to that person? Should be. Remember, you really should be. We can't do this now. Why? Because that's a whole class in and of itself. But the bottom line of that class, which we're not having, would be because everything is under the jurisdiction of God. And everything can reach tikkun. And everything can be healed. And nothing is outside the realm of God's kindness that can bring even to the darkest evil light and blessing. And that's the greatness of Isaac. Where Abraham was a man all about chesed and kindness, he was in the out and open world. Whoever wanted kindness came and got kindness. But Yitzchak, his son, went into darkness. He went into evil, and he brought kindness there. He went over to the bad guy and found the human being inside the bad guy. He met his enemy and found out that his enemy was also human. It's a big thing, right? We get so whacked out today between, are you a vaxxed or not vaxxed? I mean, we already had this. Don't you guys remember Karate Kid, vax on, vax off? Anyhow, so we have we go crazy with somebody who's like vaxxed or not vaxxed. What? You're a Democrat? What? You actually think Trump is normal? What? You like Biden? What is this? Let me tell you a little bit how Jews argue with each other, because we're really good at arguing. There are over 7,000 folios in the Talmud, and I don't think there's one page that doesn't have an argument on it. So as professional arguers, how do we argue? Well, one of the greatest arguers of all arguments were Shammai and Hillel. And the law follows Hillel. And one of the reasons, as we were talking about with Carmela and Abraham, is because Hillel always allowed Shammai to talk first. And not only did he allow him to talk first, but when Hillel began to talk, the first thing he did was repeat everything that Shammai said. And not only like a parakeet, he didn't do that. He repeated and explained it in a way to make sure that he understood what the words meant according to what Shammai was trying to say. And only after Shammai understood that he had been heard did Hillel then present his case, which might have been, and usually was, as we'll see later, 180 degrees the opposite of what Shammai was saying. So unless you can build a bridge as a human being talking to another human being, which has certain aspects such as respect, honor, and if you really want to get a lot of merit badges, you add things like kindness and love, that creates an ability to discuss anything and everything in a situation where people hear each other, respect each other, and together, hopefully, develop a love of truth, more than a love of being right. Because most people who are in love with being right are usually wrong. But people who are in love with truth are the first to admit when they're wrong, because they don't want to be right. They want to be what's true. And so even if what they have to say is completely wrong, they should be the first person to give it up. As is one of the classic arguments between another two great and wonderful arguers in the Talmud, Abaye and Rava. In one particular case, after extensive arguing back and forth, Rava finally gets Abaye up against the wall with like the foil to his neck. What does he do? He comes over to Abaye standing next to him while holding the foil and says, hey, listen, Abaye, if you say the following to me, you'll get out of this. Right? Imagine you're playing a chess game and you're one move from checkmate. And you go over to your opponent and say, oh, look, I'm about to checkmate you, but if you do this now, you'll stop this checkmate. I mean, obviously, that's not the point in chess. But the idea is, if what you're really going out after is not the win, but the truth, then the two of you are actually always on the same side of the table, even if you don't have the same side of the opinion. So that idea of Isaac was that he was able to darken through the power of black, the most powerful color there is, be able to go into the darkness of evil and illuminate it and to warm it with kindness. That's what Yitzhak was able to do with his relationship with Isaac. Now, in many places, both in the Zohar and in the Talmud, the Torah is referred to as black fire and white fire. We just talked before about the black fire as the dark fire, and now there's a concept called white fire. And both black fire and white fire are terms for the Torah. Black fire is the black letters which are written on the parchment. And the white fire is all of the rest of the space. You could say that the black letters in the Torah is what is written in the Torah. And the white fire in the Torah is what is written between the lines. So anybody who's involved in business, in contracts, it's more important to know what's written between the lines than what's written in the lines. Because the in the lines, you can read that. So what's between the lines where where problems normally arise. So, having been involved in these really high-tech world for, 400 years at this point in my life, I got to just tell you that we used to know a lot of these kind of jokes. And of course, the famous joke was a guy who was stealing a cow, and the owner realizes that possession's 9/10 of the law, and he quickly last second grabs the hind legs of the cow, pulling it back onto his property, and the thief is trying to pull it out of the property. You're pulling back and forth, and along comes a lawyer and sits down and milks the cow. So there's a lot that goes on between the lines of what's written. The white Torah or the white fire are that as well. However, here's a mind-blowing idea. The Talmud says it as well, and the Zohar writes about this, that the Torah is a potent, that's like a kind of ye old word, but I don't really, know what a modern version of that word would be, but it's a potent for life and for death.
Hang on a sec. What is it? What word did you use?
Potent. Like a potion. Excuse me, potion. I meant my mistake. Potion. The potion. It's a potion of life and a potion of death. The same Torah, which can bring you to nitzchias, to eternal life. This is just a car. All it is it takes you from the womb to the tomb. That's all it is. Don't get so confused with it. This is not who you are. It's just where you inhabit. But at some point, hopefully after 120 years, when you shed this, you continue. This consciousness continues. It doesn't die. It just becomes invisible or hidden in this world. It certainly doesn't die unless, God forbid, we kill it. So the Torah can be a tree of life, which is life, or the Torah can be the tree of knowledge of good and bad, which is death. As we see, when Adam and Eve opt for that tree, it brought about death. The same Torah is a double-edged sword. It's like nuclear power. You can use nuclear power to destroy Nagasaki or Hiroshima, or you can use nuclear power to harness the needs of cities, of whole countries. It's not nuclear power which is dangerous. It's the human which is dangerous. You know, they say, if you look at a gun, what's the most dangerous part of the gun? It's the nut behind the trigger, right? That's the only part that's dangerous. So therefore, it's the same idea here. The Torah is a double-edged sword. It actually depends on how is it that we relate to it, or how is it that we utilize it. So, So therefore, the Torah can also bring death into the world. Now, the first point we find death is really an interesting story. Everybody knows it. It's not only death, it's murder. It's a story of Cain. Cain kills his brother Abel, who I guess wasn't all that able, and he becomes the first murderer. And now he gets banished. Oh, hold on just one second here. Okay, you know what? Forget that. I skipped over a note here, which I really wanted to build up before we get to that. Okay. The Zohar says that, so the Torah's black and white letters represent life and death, but they also represent, when they come to unity, heaven and earth. Earth without heaven is seen as death. Heaven and earth together is seen as life. So therefore, they create a unity, which is a source of life. The Zohar says that the Nachash, the snake in the Garden of Eden, also created unity, but it was only a creation of unity in this world, and at the same time tried to push away or separate heaven. This is represented by the Jewish archenemy in our world called the Amalekites. The Amalekites are, Amalek is the numerical value of the Hebrew word safek, which means doubt. It's all about creating chaos and confusion so as not to be able to see clarity. But it says in the Zohar, in the Medrash, that when the Amalekites attacked the Jewish people in the desert, they cut off the circumcisions of the males, and they took the circumcisions and they threw them to heaven, as if to say to heaven, keep heaven out of earth. Leave us alone. We got technology. We don't need prayer anymore. We got science. We don't need God anymore. We got it all figured out. We don't need any God. Got it all taken care of down here on earth. Thank you very much. So Amalek was about rejection of heaven. This is also about Gog in the famous or infamous war of Gog and Magog in the end of days. God will unify almost every nation in the world to attack Jerusalem. He will create tremendous human unity, which will be built through anti-Semitism, because everyone has a mutual enemy, right? So the enemy of my enemy, or however that goes, I forgot already, whatever. So that idea is that there'll be an amazing unity, but the unity will be a rejection of God and holiness in this world. So the snake, which created unity in this world, created a separation from heaven. This is hinted at when it says in the creation of the Torah, God says, when referring to the sun and the moon, God says, let them be luminaries. I always love these English translations, but that's the word they use, luminaries. The sun and the moon will be luminaries. In Hebrew, the word is ma'orot. Ma'orot, the letters inside ma'orot is the word or, which means light. The letters on the outside, we call the klipa, the shell of the word ma'orot, is death, mate. Mem top is met, which is death. In the middle is light. So these luminaries on an internal level are brilliant light, like heaven, like the top of Mount Sinai, but they are surrounded by darkness, which is death. That's the free will represented in this idea of the moon and the light. The moon and the sun. So that when the light, a holy light, is blocked from coming into this world, this creates death. This is hinted at in the Hebrew word for truth, emet. The Gemara in Tainus says that Yaakov lo met, Jacob never died. It's kind of funny, right? Because we read in the Bible that Jacob was mummified. right? But the Gemara says that he never died. So a lot of people explain, what does that mean he never died? One is that, if you look at the stars, even the closest stars are something like 70 million light years away from us. So you might be looking at something that's a vivid light, but that light no longer exists. So Yaakov, of course he died, but his light is right here, because here we are, 2021, still talking about him. So his light is still shining. Another way to understand it is that, in fact, the prida, the separation of the soul from the body, Talmud says there are 900 plus different ways to die. And the worst of them is asphyxiation, which is used as a metaphor of an inverted thorn being drawn through cotton. The soul just does not want to come out of the body. But the highest form, which is called the neshika, which is called the kiss, is used in metaphor as a eyelash whisked out of milk. In the same way that a hand just comes out of the glove, the soul comes out of the body. There's no death experience. Maybe that was an idea of what Yaakov meant, but we look at it differently. The verse also says, Titain emet liYaakov. Truth was given to Jacob. Now that idea of truth being given to Jacob is interesting, because the word in Hebrew for truth, emet, contains in it the word death, met. If you take away the aleph from the word truth, all that's left is the word for death in Hebrew. Because a human being is three components. One, I'm going to work backwards, is the letter Tuf, which stands for the word Torah, which we could call wisdom, spiritual enlightenment. The next letter is the letter Mem, which stands for the word mitzvot, normally translated as commandments, but we could talk about them as right action of the body or speech as well. And then you have the Aleph, which is for Ahava, which is love, which is Echad, which is one God, our connection to God. So when that Aleph is lost, all that's left is death. So you could have somebody who might look on the outside like the most religious Jew you've ever seen in your life, with a really long beard and side curls and all the rest of that. And he uses the name Rabbi, and he's in a rabbi, and he's a rabbi. I think there was a Beatles song like that, Rabbi, Rabbi, Rabbi. And he has all these rabbis. But when you go inside, whoa, it could really be that he's dead. You can see somebody else who might look like totally non-religious person. You go inside, you think he just came into the Garden of Eden. So the Aleph is the critical component. That's the component to which we are joined. And that light is the light that shines in these luminaries. Now, without it is death. Now we come to the story of Cain. Cain was the first one that brought death into the world when he murdered his brother Abel. Talmud begins to say, the Zohar says that there are 7 levels of earth, parallel universes. Many of us are familiar with this idea of 7 levels of heaven. I think they even have a chocolate cake called 7 layers of heaven cake, something like that. There's 7 layers of heaven, and then there's earth. But the Zohar says, no, earth also has 7 parallel universes. And the Zohar says that when Cain killed his brother, he was banished from our level of earth to another parallel level, which is known in Hebrew as Arka. Arka, as opposed to, let's say, earth or Eretz, Arka is where he went. Now, the Zohar explains this area where he goes and says that in the universe of Arka, there are 2 rulers. It's going to sound very much like Zoroastrianism. But there are 2 rulers there, one that rules over the light and one that rules over the dark. The one that rules over the night is an ox, a bull, because in Talmud, the bull is always associated. Those of you that have ever learned Gemara, you'll be familiar with the Arba Nezikin, the damager. The ox is something which is goring, which is damaging, and so on. And so therefore, the other one, which represents light, is the eagle. So the eagle is something that soars, even though the Talmud says that both of these animals had 6 wings. We're not going to go down there, but the 6 wings have to do with the 6 days of creation, meaning that their scope of power is in every aspect of creation. This light and dark challenge between each other of the ox and the eagle. The Zohar goes on to say when the leader or the ruler of light is in control, then the image of the ox and the eagle morph into the image of a human being. When the guiding principle at hand is wisdom and light, that's when the image of God in all of us comes forward. When the power of darkness, the ox, let's say, is in power, then the ox and the eagle, they morph into a two-headed snake. So you see, this comes back to the concept of the Garden of Eden. This is between the tree of life, where we see ourselves as made in the image of God, versus the tree of knowledge, which will use our knowledge to create God in our image. In other words, we set the rules. We determine what God can and cannot do. We say what's permissible, what's not permissible. It makes us feel like God, right? Because when you can tell what to do, not to do, you feel like God. What was the seductive line that got the snake to get Eve to bite into the apple, which of course wasn't an apple, but doesn't matter, because he said, you'll be like God. You'll know what's right and wrong. Hopefully you do, but if you don't, that leads to death. So therefore, this idea of the double-headed snake versus the image of man, this is coming down onto the lower level of the struggle between this inner light or darkness, which we can choose. Now let's watch one more idea, and then we're going to get into Hanukkah. So when God said in the Bible, let there be light, the Zohar says that this light didn't last very long. It lasted, as Rabbi Tamara hinted at, for 36 hours. Rather than that moment, after the 36 hours, it became known as the Or HaGanuz, the hidden light. Doesn't mean the light was no longer there. It just meant that we could no longer see it. It's still there, but it's considered as the hidden light. The Zohar says that this hidden light, however, became infused, metaphorically, in what is known as Shoshana Yaakov, or sometimes translated as the mystical rose. And the mystical rose is given the power to bear fruit. And this mystical rose, which can bear fruit, is the circumcision. Because the male, unlike the female, which is why the male requires many more commandments than the female, because a female is much more intuitively in touch with God, which is why God, when looking between the male and the female, chose her to be the partner with creation to bear children. But the male, again, this doesn't necessarily mean male, female, as we are looking at each other's here. That's a whole nother class, because in the Zohar world, we are taught that every human being is part male, part female, and there are female souls in male bodies and male souls in female bodies. And, you know, if you're Woody Allen, you probably have 30 different people living inside of you. But you know, it's all a kind of chaos that goes on, which we don't want. We don't want chaos. We want order and clarity. But the idea of male and female, let's switch out of human beings and talk about electricity. You have the male plug and the female plug. Male is always considered the force which gives, and the female, the force which receives. So something could be female in reference to the giver. For example, the Jewish nation are called female because we receive from God, but then are used in terms of male when we give the wisdom that we receive. It's a question of giving and receiving, yin and yang. It's what it's all about, that kind of harmony and that balance. But in the idea of the circumcision, this represents the greatest sexual drive, hopefully. And that sexual energy is usually the battle point between whether or not a person will really subjugate their energies in the service of God, i.e. in the fruition of being all that you were meant to be, or it's used to service themselves like Pharaoh and making ourselves into an idol. But that sexual energy is really why the first commandment in the Bible is to be fruitful and multiply. It's the most powerful energy it is. That is the life force. And the Balatori points out in a kind of interesting way, this is hinted at, because in Hebrew, the 4 words of et haor ki tov, because God saw the light was good, in the Hebrew, these 4 words if you take the last letter of each of the 4 words, they spell the word Brit, which is circumcision. So you see this amazing connection between the male circumcision somehow is the vestitude of this infinite light, and how will it ultimately be manifest in the world? Which is why many times, not just amongst Jews, unfortunately in many religions, you will see people who strive to be very holy, and then all of a sudden they fail, and the failure often is in the sexual arena, with children, with who knows what. Doesn't really make a difference. Everyone has their own weakness. But the point is that the sexual weakness, in a way, is because they didn't really work on their inner self. They didn't really work on making it for real. Maybe they were working too much on making it to appear like they're holy. But real holiness, that's the test in that aspect of sexuality, in terms of how they channel that energy. Okay, so now, the Talmud says that this result of hiding the light, and the only way that we see the light is through this garment of light. It's called heavy light. Rashi points out in the end of days, again, metaphorically speaking, the light of this sun will be insignificant compared to the light that will be in the future, which, you know, talking about global warming, can only imagine what that's going to be like. But nonetheless, hopefully we'll be able to deal with it. Because the heavy light, which is the light of the garment, the Midrash says that God showed Moses how the world was created by wrapping himself in a talit of light. Now, light, the garment of light, hides and reveals. Remember, we talked about that before. That first dot of light of Bereshit hides and reveals. How does that work? So the words in Hebrew for clothing, one is called beged. Beged is the 3 of the first 4 letters, right? Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled. Bet, Gimel, Daled. Beged, it hides the Aleph, right? Hiding the Aleph is the difference between truth and death, emet and met. It hides the Aleph, but it reveals the Aleph. How does that work? How does clothing work? If you see somebody naked, you know, it either might be a turn on or you might get sick. But, you know, when you see somebody naked, you don't, that's what you see. You see their body. But when you see somebody with clothes, you see their soul. You see their personality. Because there was a cognitive decision to put on that shirt or that makeup or that hairstyle, assuming you still have hair, right? Or whatever it is, those things are reflections of you, which the other person would never see. So by hiding your body, in a sense, with clothing, you're actually revealing something much more personal and intimate inside of you that otherwise it would be hidden. And so that's where the word beged comes from. Beged hides and it reveals. It hides the light because we can't see the light, but it reveals enough of the light that we are able to absorb it. Now, how much do we absorb? Well, Talmud says in a very beautiful way. I'm imagining we're here a mature audience of everybody over 18. Some of us, like myself, quite a few times over 18. But the Talmud says that when the ark, which sat in the temple, it had 2 poles. Probably if you never saw it in the Bible, you might have seen it in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It had those 2 poles. And then in the second temple, there was a curtain. And it says that the space was such that the poles were not inside the room, but they actually protruded into the curtain. And the Talmud poetically says, like a woman's breasts protrude from her sweater or from her shirt. And the commentators say, I mean, there's so many different analogies. Why do we use that analogy? And the answer is as follows. Because the miracle of a woman's breast or nipple is that the nipple is designed in a way that it only releases as much milk as the baby can suck. The breast can create ample milk, but the nipple is such a miraculous valve that it will only release milk according to the baby's suck, so the baby will not choke or drown. So too, the metaphor. Think of our brains as sucking this divine nectar or wisdom from the Torah. This is the ark where the Torah is. But the beauty is that the Torah is infinite. How can you suck down infinity? But Hashem made it in a way where, according to our knowledge, that's how much wisdom will happen to us. Because if we get overloaded with wisdom, it's not a good thing. You know, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says that while oil is what gives the lamp fire to burn, too much oil will put the lamp out. So too, also, a person has got too much information, they get very tired. But if they're just on the right curve of that information, they're able to absorb it. You're muted if you wanted to say something. Sorry.
Yeah, I wonder when you're going to go to Chanuka.
Well, Hanukkah is like 30 days from now, so I still have a little time. As my rabbi always said, the answer to most questions is on the next page. So we're almost there. Actually, the truth
because you mentioned it a half an hour ago, so or even 40 minutes ago. So I wonder.
I know, but the truth is, hopefully, when you'll go back over the video, you realize this whole class was about Hanukkah. It really was.
Okay, I understand.
Okay.
I understand, but I mean, I
so therefore, okay, let's get there. But, well, guess what? The next here, look, I'll show you this. This is where I am.
Okay.
And the next sentence is, "This is the secret of Hanukkah." So we got there. You were right on the money. Okay.
Listen, I'm reminded of somebody who wanted to be a rabbi, I think in Rotterdam. And they always had to do the presentations, and this came a presentation, a so grim presentation, the third came a presentation. And finally there was somebody who had a long talk, and there was people sitting at the back, and they say, I guess we have to have this one because I don't understand a word of him.
Well, I hope you understood a lot of my words, you know. So this idea of the revealed light through being hidden and revealed is that at that point, when the world will be complete, the original light will become revealed. And that is into the secret of Hanukkah. As everybody knows, Hanukkah has 8 candles. And one of the things that's interesting about the number 8, at least how it's in the Western world, is that the number 8, if you turn on its side, people always notice that it becomes the infinity symbol. In fact, somebody showed on Facebook, there was a cute little cartoon, and it was the number 8 sitting on a psychiatrist's couch. And the psychiatrist says, well, why don't you lie down? He says, if I did that, I'll be here forever, right? So the number 8, even in Judaism, always represents something which is infinite, which is beyond the 7 days of creation. And in the idea of these ideas, the 7 days is called the 8th day. Hanukkah is referred to as the 8th day, which circumcision is also the 8th day, because circumcision, again, is binding one's energy to beyond the natural world, to the supernatural, or to the divine, or to the holy world. So therefore, this idea of Hanukkah is something which is bringing the infinite light into our world. And how does this happen? So now, as I mentioned before, also, one of the arguments between Shammai and Hillel is, as most of you probably know, how do we light Hanukkah candles? So Shammai says we light 8 candles on the first night, and each night we light 1 less candle. Hillel, which is what we're familiar and with what we do, says no, you light 1 candle on the first night, and each night you add a candle until you come to 8. So 1 is going from 8 to 1, and 1 is going from 1 to 8. And I somehow remember doing a Hanukkah class with you guys last year where I think we talked about this, because this idea of 8 to 1 and 1 to 8, on this, the Torah says, Zeh v'zeh divrei Elokim chayim. These are both the will of God. What? How could they both be the will of God when they're completely opposite directions? Make up your mind. 8 to 1 is the same thing as 1 to 8. So if you watch this, this is really cool. I think it's really cool, but I feel you'll find it's also really cool. Watch this. Okay? This is going from here to here. It's going 8 to 1, 8 to 1. This one is going from here to here. 1 to 8, 1 to 8, 8 to 1, 8 to 1. Now, If this is a circle, you will suddenly realize that they're actually all going in the same direction, right? The circle goes in the same direction. At this point, segment, it's going this way. At this point, the segment is going this way. But the circle is really only going in one direction. So Shammai always takes the segment of heaven, as I'll explain in a few more minutes, and Hillel always takes the segment of earth, heaven and earth. So that's why they together, unified, create the will of God, because the will of God is a unity between heaven and earth, and they both reflect that. How? So Shammai is the from heaven to earth perspective. This is also symbolized in the Star of David, the triangle in the double delta that comes from above down. This is Shammai, taking heaven and finding a way to bring it down into this world. So therefore, Shammai says, in the perfect world beyond nature, where all is revealed, i.e. the first day of creation or the beginning or even before creation, when all 8 lights are visible, these lights come down and down and down into a darker world where they become harder and harder to be seen, but there's always at least one light left. There's always a door for humans to find the light of kindness and wisdom. That's what he's all about. And how does he learn it? Because of a certain sacrifice that's performed on the holiday of Sukkot. Sukkot is the only other holiday that's also 8 days. It also represents above and beyond time. And during that time, there were 70 bulls, ox, right? Remember our famous tourist site in the land of Arca, the parallel universe? There were 70 bulls that were offered for the 70 nations of the world. Meaning what? That the light, as it comes down into this world, will slowly diminish the bull, the damaging element that creates chaos and lack of law and principle and the things that we need to live in our world, until the bulls are extinguished and that light is then manifest in this world. That's what Shammai is all about. Hillel takes the earth to heaven perspective. Hillel says, well, what about me down here on earth? What am I supposed to do? So what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to wake up tomorrow morning a better person than I was yesterday. Otherwise, I'm just a vegetable. Otherwise, I'm just an animal eating food. Because if I'm not growing, I'm dying. So I'm growing every day. Every day I'm adding more light in my life. I am more and more and more and more, to the point when you wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, you might not even recognize who you see, because you're a whole new person today. You wake up and you say, Modani lefanecha melechai b'kayam shechazarti bi nishmasi bechemla rabba munasecha, as we shared with Abraham and Carmela, that we wake up and the first thing we say when we open our eyes and we know, wow, I'm alive, because sleep is like death. Coming awake in the morning is like resurrection of the dead. The first thing I say is moda, which is an intense form of toda. It means really thankful. I'm really thankful to you, God, for having returned my soul to my body. How do we end it? Bi'amuna secha. Amuna secha doesn't mean my faith in God. It means God's faith in me, right? As we said, and again, forgive me, Abraham and Carmela, but we said in that other earlier class, we said, people often say, I believe in God. And I often say, who cares? I mean, nothing personal, but who cares? Okay, mazel tov. So who cares, right? Even if you don't believe in God, still my brother, you're still my sister, it's like, whatever, who cares? And it's a really insignificant question. So you want to know the question is, does God believe in you, right? Ooh, I don't know if I believe in God. Big deal. But, God believes in me. Woo-hoo-hoo. That's a real important thing to know. In fact, my whole life might depend on that. So that's something I might want to focus on. Does God believe in me? Answer, yes, absolutely. How do you know? Because you're alive. God gave you another day. Here you are. You woke up in the morning, grab that day. Don't be a prisoner of your past. Don't let your past steal your future. Because guess what? You know, I remember in New York, we used to have an expression, time flies when you're having fun. When you get older, you know what? Time flies. Stop. Doesn't matter if you're having fun. It just flies. And every time you say, wow, I can't believe how fast it's going, you then 10 years later, that wasn't fast. This was fast, right? So kind of like the end of the roll of the toilet paper, woo, when you get down to the end, right? So you got to grab it. You got to grab life and not be a prisoner of your past. Stop looking backwards and blaming everyone else about why your problems are happening. Turn around and walk forward and look at what could be happening. And you can do it. Just take hold of that life. So that's what Hillel is all about. Take hold of life. Every day, add another candle and add another candle. And guess what? What happens when you add up those candles of Hanukkah, right? 8 days, some simple math here. Nothing like Maxwell's formula, so don't worry. But watch this, it's real easy. 1 plus 2 is 3, plus 3 is 6, plus 4 is 10, plus 5 is 15, plus 6 is 21, plus 7 is 28, plus 8 is 36. You light 36 candles on Hanukkah because they are the 36 hours that the hidden light existed in the world. And the Gemara says that when a person is born and their soul is parachuting, hopefully with a parachute, parachuting down into this world, I don't know if have you ever gone deep sea diving or really into deep, deep water. You know that the deeper you get, it gets cold. It gets dark as you get down there. And if you get a little turned around, you might think you're swimming back to the surface, but you're actually going lower. So I won't go into those stories. I'll say that for another time, personal experiences. However, the point is, as that soul is coming down, it's getting cold and dark. It's no longer that blow away heaven thing. It's like coming down into earth, which I think is spelled U-R-F, earth. It's the sound the soul makes when it hits the ground, right? So you're now living this place, earth, and you suffer amnesia. You don't remember what the heck you're doing here. So where am I, right? But that coming down into this earth, the soul says it freaks out until it sees the light of the menorah in this world. And then it's comforted because it knows there will always be at least one candle that's burning. Now watch this. Many people are familiar with the Hanukkah miracle. What's the Hanukkah miracle? Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch actually debate this point. Because on a simple level, they needed a 7-day period in order to purify the oil required to burn in the menorah. So they had enough in this one flask for 1 day, plus the 7 days. That's why they had an 8-day window. So there's an argument. Did they burn that entire flask in 1 day, but it miraculously burned for 8 days? Or maybe they divided it into eighths, but yet each eighth burnt a whole day. I mean, this is just the way the Talmud works. It goes into analysis as to what is actually the miracle per se. But the real idea of the miracle, simple said, is that there was not enough to burn, and however it was divided, it burnt. So now, what is the lesson here? So there are two very interesting lessons. There's the obvious lesson and there's the hidden lesson. The obvious lesson is that it's based on a Gemara of Bendosa, who was the great miracle worker of the Talmud, whose daughter freaked out because it was like 2 minutes before lighting candles for Shabbat and there was no more oil. And she ran in, she said to her dad, all we have is vinegar. And her father said, light the vinegar. And she said, vinegar doesn't burn. And he said, what? The same God that makes oil burn will make the vinegar burn. And the vinegar burnt. Now, we could try to burn vinegar, it's not going to happen. He was not expressing an intellectual idea. He understood in his bones that this is what's really happening. Yes, there's nature, but it's a veil. And anyhow, the numerical value of the word hateva, nature in Hebrew, is also God's name of Elohim. So it's all God. He wanted to penetrate to the deeper level of God, which was beyond nature. And because he really believed it with his essence, and not just intellectually, he could actually burn vinegar, where you and I probably could never do it if we tried from today till tomorrow. So therefore, the miracle of the burning of the oil was not only that it transcended the world of nature and a miracle happened, but there was another miracle, and that is that oil even burns. It's as big a miracle that oil burns as it is that he made vinegar burn. Because the reason oil burns is not because of the scientific composition of oil. That's the expression of how oil burns. But oil burns because God wills it to burn. So even something which is lacking that same physical manifestation has the deeper back-end component of the will of God, if you know how to tap into it. So that was the real miracle of Hanukkah and the 8-day candelabra. But there's another miracle of Hanukkah that most people don't know about. And this is the Gemara in Menachos. The Gemara in Menachos says that, as we know, the menorah have 7 candelabras as opposed to the Chanukiah. And it was faced, the menorah was placed in a way that it went from east to west. So there was the candle which was furthest to the west was called, even though the others didn't have a name, this one was called the Western Candle. Now, this miracle you have to understand took place over not 8 days of Hanukkah, but 1,200 years. If you take the roughly 400 years that the tabernacle, we call the Mishkan, existed, plus the 400 plus change years of the first temple, and the 400 plus change of the second temple, that's 1,200 years. That's not 8 days. 1,200 years, according to the Jews, but like, hey, who believes them? There was a miracle. And what was the miracle? That although every one of the candelabras were giving the exact amount of oil and they were all lit at the same time, every morning when the Kohen, the priest, came in, the one candle by the western wall was still burning. In fact, in synagogues today, we have something, I'll say it in Hebrew, which is called a ner tamid, a perpetual light that never goes off. And that source of having that light in a synagogue is from the Western candle, which never went out. So there was the aspect of the miracle, which is beyond nature, Hanukkah, and then there's an aspect of miracle, which is within nature, which is the menorah. How is the menorah a representation of nature, and where do we see the miracle within? Well, the 7 candles of the candelabra, the menorah, correlate to the human head. The way that the menorah was built is there were 3 candles on the left and the right, and the trunk, which went down to the base, was the middle 7th candle. In fact, many people, myself included, we always think of Shabbat as the end and the beginning of the week. It's not. Shabbat's the middle of the week. There are 3 days that build up to Shabbat, and then there are 3 days that come down from Shabbat. This is why, for example, the Havdalah service of separating Shabbat from the rest of the week can even be performed on Tuesday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, because there's still light from the Shabbat that can be used for the Havdalah. And this is why, if you look in your prayer book and you see the song of the day, which relates to Wednesday, at the very end of it is the first verse of the beginning of Kabbalat Shabbat. And the Hasidim call Wednesday Little Shabbat, because it's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, already coming up to the middle day. And in fact, this is why the 6 wicks were all pointing to the middle candle. And the middle candle, which was in the south, pointed to the north, because the word for north in Hebrew, tzfon, is connected to the word for hidden. So therefore, the light is trying to penetrate the darkness, the hidden, to reveal that light. And how does this correlate to our head? Because our head have 7 holes, hopefully. Grew up in New York, you might have a few extra. But basically, we start off with 7. So you have 3 sets of 2. You have 2 ears, 2 eyes, and 2 nostrils. Their function is input. I hear that. I can hear that as well. I see your point. I can also see his point. Well, I can smell a difference. You know, in New York, we used to say on a bad business, I smell a rat, right? You can smell a difference. And the differences between these 3 inputs really don't matter for right now. But the 7th hole, which is in the dead center, like the center of the 7 candelabras, is the mouth. And its main function is output. The information comes in, it's all run into the brain. The brain sends that information after it processes it to the heart, because you have to have a heart. It's not enough the cold letter of the law. It's the feeling of the law. It's the information between the lines. It's the human compassion element in the law. And therefore, that human element is the heart. The heart has scales. It weighs what is really correct. And then one heart, one mouth. It tells the mouth what to say. The mouth bridges the opposites into one. It creates a resolution to conflict. You have a conflict here. Should I do this? Should I do that? Well, if I have a goal in mind, if I have a hierarchy, if I have a game plan, if I have a roadmap and I know where I'm going, how do I resolve conflict? I go like this. I realize there's value in both, but right now, this point is more relevant to the needs of the now. It doesn't negate the validity of this point. They're both valid. You know, I have, like in Israel, people are so into politics. I burnt out in politics after the Vietnamese War, but they're so into it. People are like, I'm a left winger, I'm a right winger. I said, well, you really? You ever see a bird fly with only one wing? So there's value in left and right. It's not left or right, it's left and right. But the question is, when you need to resolve a thing, you need to have a sense of your framework, to have a perspective to know what to be able to deal with it. So that's the function of the mouth. And these are the 7 points that represent themselves in the idea of the Chanukiah. And when we are in a state where we're able to bring that holiness, that inner light that comes out from within us, this becomes something phenomenal. And this is my last point, or second to last point. That is, if you open up the Bible, you go back to the beginning. So you'll see that when it's talking about all the creation, there's a terminology that's repeated throughout this event. And that is, it begins with the word vayas, and it was, vayas Elohim, and God did or created or made it, or it was vayas. And at the end it says vahi came, and it was. It was. God made it, and it was. Vayas came. He made it, it was. Probably when God does it, there's no hang time between the two. It's kind of simultaneous, but vayas came, except by light. When it talks about the creation of light, it doesn't use that terminology. It's missing. Where's the vayas came of light? Well, it's way down at the other end of the Bible. You got to come into the 4th book, Bamidbar. You got to come into the Parsha, the section of the Torah called Bolasecha. And all of a sudden, the very beginning of this Parsha, like out of left field, because the description of all the vessels and the building of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, was way back over there in Vayikra. And all of a sudden now in Bamidbar, you thought you like finished with it all. Whammo, suddenly are a few verses about the menorah. The menorah reappears. What's going on? The difference is the menorah back over there is talking about its shape and form and how to make it. The menorah over here is talking about how to light it, how to make the light come out of it. And all of a sudden, if you look over here, you will see it says, Vayas came Aaron. And Aaron, not God, Aaron did so. Tremendous. God creates everything. Everything is, God says it, and it is. God says it as it is. Everything has a garment, except for the tohu vohu, except for the chaos and the void and the without form. Why? Because we are partners in creation. How do we give the final form, the one thing that doesn't have the garment? By creating the light. Aaron lights the menorah. Who was Aaron? Aaron was a person whose whole life was about shalom. He would go over to two people fighting, and he would lie. And he would say to, or let's say he would change the story. You know, it's like a little white lie. Like white lie is kind of like a neo-Nazi. I'm not really a Nazi, only a neo-Nazi. But no, it wasn't really a lie, it was only a white lie, whatever that means, okay? But he would go over and he would say, you know, your friend feels really bad, which he didn't say. He feels really bad for arguing with you. And then he goes, this guy's, you know, your friend feels really bad, which he didn't say. And then when they saw each other, they were able to get together because they knew that each one felt bad. So he would bring peace between the ones that fight with each other. He'd bring peace between man and wife who fought with each other. He would run. He wouldn't just wait for someone to knock on the door and say, I got a problem. He would run, Rodef Shalom. He would run diligently to make peace. He couldn't sleep at night. He lived on a planet made of fire. There was no resting. Why would you rest while every tick of the clock is another opportunity to become more and more and more than you could be forever? Why would you rest? Why would you kill time? What? So he would live time and he would run after peace. And not only did he run after peace between people and people, he ran after peace between man and God, between heaven and earth. He undid the division the snake created. The snake brought death, the snake brought chaos, and Aaron brings light, and Aaron brings peace. And where do you see this? Aaron walks with Moses into the court of Pharaoh. Aaron's staff, not Moses' staff, Aaron's staff is thrown on the floor and it becomes a snake. The Egyptians are like, oh, you're bringing coals to Newcastle? They all throw their staffs on the ground and they become snakes. Now what happens? If you don't read the Torah carefully, you would think that you read that Aaron's snake swallowed their snakes. That's not what it says. Maybe in English, I don't know. In Dutch, I for sure don't know. But in Lashon HaKodesh, in Hebrew, that's not what it says. It says that Aaron's staff swallowed their staffs. What does this mean? It means that the Nachash, the snake, is the symbol of chaos, of void, of without form, of everything which is not real reality. It's illusion / delusion. And the staff represents creation, what it is. So therefore, Aaron says, I can put my stick on the ground and I can create the illusion, meaning that the staff, when it's not in the hand of the holy person, it becomes a snake. Moses at the burning bush, God says, what's in your hand? Again, staff. He says, throw the staff down. What happens? It becomes a snake. He takes hold of it. It becomes a staff. It's the same tree. It's a question of tree of life or tree of death. In the hand of a holy person, of which we are all holy, it becomes a staff to build life. Out of our hands, it becomes the snake. So Aaron throws it down and says, look, you want to talk mystery? Here's the snake. They throw their sticks down. They're the snakes. But there's no reality to the snake. So therefore, hold on just for a minute. There's no reality to the snake. So therefore, the staff has to swallow the other staffs. And once that mystery is dispelled through the light, you turn on the light, you see what's really going on. So this is why the numerical value of the word snake, Nachash, is the same as the word Mashiach, Messiah. Because as soon as the darkness which the snake creates is dispelled, the Mashiach and the redemption and the light, which is hinted at by the Chanukiah, which represented in the menorah, comes to the world and creates the peace and the real world that we long for and desire. Sorry, Ken. Rabbi Tamari wanted to say something?
No, I want to say that you might start wrapping up.
That's the end
because
of it.
I think everybody is just falling apart and don't want to go.
I'm done. Bye-bye.
No.
I was done. Just like you got the second, when am I starting Hanukkah? You got the second I finished. So as we say in New York, you're going 2 for 2. Anyhow, if there were any questions on the class, I'm sure that Rabbi Tamar will be happy to answer them.
No.
And it's really very wonderful. I really have a soft spot for Holland, because I grew up in New Amsterdam, although they changed the name to New York.
Yeah.
B, because my family lived in Amsterdam. I once discovered in the late 1700s, although I don't really remember it, as old as I am. I still don't remember it. And 3, every time I'm ever there, I think I really have a wonderful time. I
Okay.
know I do, and I meet such wonderful people.
We will invite you in person again
God willing.
soon.